Picture yourself standing at the edge of a dusty medieval road, the weight of a simple wooden staff in your hand, and a cloth pouch holding your only possessions. Ahead lies a path stretching hundreds of miles through forests teeming with wolves, mountains shrouded in mist, and villages where strangers might rob you, or worse. Yet you take that first step, driven by a faith so fierce it drowns out the fear. This wasn't just a journey, it was a pilgrimage, a test of body and soul that defined the lives of countless men and women in the Middle Ages. Their stories are woven with threads of desperation and devotion, of miracles whispered in the shadows of cathedrals and survival against impossible odds. Today, we're not just recounting history, we're walking in their footsteps, feeling the ache in their bones and the fire in their hearts as they chased something greater than themselves. What would compel someone to leave behind everything: home, safety, even family, for a chance to kneel before a distant shrine? The answer lies in a world where heaven felt close enough to touch, where saints walked in dreams and relics pulsed with divine power. For medieval pilgrims, the journey was more than travel. It was a sacred act, a bargain with the divine. Some sought healing for incurable ailments, others forgiveness for sins that haunted them, and many simply yearned to prove their faith through suffering. But the road was merciless. Bandits lurked in the hollows of ancient trees, storms could swallow whole parties without a trace, and hunger was a constant companion. Yet somehow, against all logic, many survived, often with tales of mysterious strangers offering bread, of visions guiding them through blizzards, of wounds healing overnight. Were these miracles or the sheer stubbornness of the human spirit? This is a story of cracks in the fabric of the ordinary, where the impossible brushed up against the everyday. It's about the innkeepers who sheltered pilgrims without asking for coin, the thieves who had sudden changes of heart, and the unshakable belief that every step brought them closer to grace. By the end of this journey together, you'll understand why these travelers, despite the dirt on their robes and the blisters on their feet, were seen as heroes of their age. Their legacy isn't just in the roads they walked, but in the hope they carried, a light that still flickers centuries later. So take a deep breath. We're about to step onto that path, where every mile holds a secret, and every shadow might just be something holy. To understand why medieval pilgrimage became such a powerful force, you have to step into a world where heaven and earth felt intertwined. This was an era when people believed saints could intervene in daily life, when a fragment of a holy relic might cure disease, and where the afterlife loomed so large it shaped every decision. The Church didn't just encourage pilgrimage, it wove the practice into the very fabric of salvation. Penance for sins could be measured in miles walked, and a journey to a sacred site might shave years off purgatory. But it wasn't just fear of divine punishment that set feet on the road. For many, pilgrimage offered something rare in medieval life, a taste of freedom. Peasants bound to the land, craftsmen trapped in grueling routines, even nobles weighed down by duty, all could become equal on the pilgrim's path, stripped of worldly status by a simple cloak and staff. The most famous routes became highways of hope. Santiago de Compostela in Spain drew travelers with the promise of St. James's miraculous protection, while Rome's holy doors offered absolution to those who reached them. But Jerusalem, the ultimate prize, was a perilous trek through war zones and pirate-infested seas, reserved for the bravest or most desperate. Along these paths, entire economies sprang up to serve the wandering faithful. Monasteries offered shelter, towns sold lead badges as proof of pilgrimage, and enterprising locals guided travelers through treacherous passes for a fee. Even the poorest pilgrim might scrape together coins for the journey, knowing that begging along the way was itself a form of humility blessed by God. Yet beneath the spiritual fervor lay very human temptations. Some travelers used pilgrimage as cover for escape, fleeing debts, unhappy marriages, or even crimes. Others sought not just salvation but adventure. The Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, revels in this irony, a band of pilgrims trading raunchy stories on their way to a saint's shrine. For every genuinely devout soul, there was another chasing rumors of wealth in distant cities or the thrill of seeing the world beyond their village. That's the real magic of medieval pilgrimage. It wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the transformation that happened along the way, where faith, ambition, and sheer curiosity collided under the wide medieval sky. Among the countless holy sites dotting the medieval world, three names stood above the rest: Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela, each radiating a magnetic pull that drew pilgrims across continents. Jerusalem, the crown jewel, wasn't just a city. It was the living stage of Christ's final days, where the very stones of the Via Dolorosa were said to whisper prayers underfoot. To kneel at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where tradition held that Jesus was buried and resurrected, was the ultimate act of devotion. But getting there meant braving a gauntlet of dangers: hostile rulers, treacherous seas, and deserts where water was scarcer than mercy. Yet pilgrims still came, some with nothing but faith stitching their shoes together, convinced that touching the rock of Golgotha would scrub their souls clean. Rome offered a different kind of redemption. Here, pilgrims could walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs, tracing their fingers along the chains that once bound St. Peter, or gazing at the Veronica's veil, believed to bear the imprint of Christ's face. The city's holy doors, opened only during Jubilee years, promised total absolution to those who passed through them, a spiritual reset button for the weary. But Rome also thrived on spectacle. The bones of martyrs were displayed like jewels, and the faithful could buy tiny vials of holy air from the catacombs. It was a place where the divine and the theatrical blurred, where a beggar's rags might hide a saint, and every corner seemed to hum with miracles. Then there was Santiago de Compostela, nestled in Spain's rugged northwest. The legend of St. James's rediscovered bones, guided by a shower of stars, gave the site an almost celestial glow. Pilgrims wore scallop shells as badges of honor, their routes marked by roadside chapels where weary travelers could rest. But what made Compostela unique was its camaraderie. Unlike the solitary peril of the Jerusalem trek, the Camino became a moving community, a river of strangers sharing food, stories, and blisters. Miracles here felt intimate: a farmer's wife leaving bread on a windowsill, a shepherd leading lost pilgrims home by lamplight. Smaller shrines, too, pulsed with their own magic. Canterbury's fame exploded after Thomas Becket's murder, when his blood was said to heal the blind and crippled. Walsingham in England became known as England's Nazareth, where a vision of the Virgin Mary had once appeared. Even obscure village wells could gain fame overnight if a child claimed to see the Virgin there. These stories weren't just folklore, they were the fuel that kept pilgrims walking. When a mother prayed over a relic and her feverish child recovered, or a knight swore a saint's ghost shielded him from bandits, those tales spread like wildfire. They turned dusty roads into sacred threads, connecting the ordinary to the extraordinary, one hopeful step at a time. The road to redemption was never easy, but for medieval pilgrims, every blister and bruise carried divine weight. Imagine a knight who'd spilled blood in battle, haunted by faces of the fallen, now walking barefoot through winter mud to atone, or a mother who'd lost 3 children to plague, clutching a candle vowed to burn at a saint's shrine if just one survived. These weren't abstract gestures, they were visceral negotiations with the divine, where pain became a kind of currency. The Church taught that pilgrimage could scrub a soul clean, turning blisters into badges of penance. A murderer might be sentenced to walk 300 miles in chains. A cheating wife could be ordered to sleep on church steps for 40 nights. But even without formal punishment, pilgrims often chose suffering, sleeping in ditches, fasting for weeks, crawling the last miles on bloodied knees. Why? Because in a world where pain was everywhere, directing it toward salvation made it meaningful. Yet not all pilgrims were drowning in guilt. Some sought clarity, like the merchant who abandoned his stall after dreaming of Saint Christopher, or the teenage girl who fled an arranged marriage to follow whispers of the Virgin Mary's healing spring. For them, pilgrimage was less about punishment than transformation, a chance to rewrite their story under open skies. Monasteries along the routes kept records of these seekers. The nobleman who traded his silks for a beggar's rags to test his soul's worth. The shepherd who claimed angels guided him to share his last crust of bread. Even skeptics found themselves caught in the current. A 14th century French chronicle tells of a thief who joined pilgrims to rob them, only to collapse in tears at a roadside crucifix and join their prayers instead. The genius of medieval pilgrimage was how it met people where they were. For the desperate, it offered structure, a finite ordeal with a clear finish line. For the lost, it provided purpose, turning restless wandering into sacred motion. And for the merely curious, it was the ultimate adventure with God as your travel guide. That's why a single pilgrim's satchel might hold a vial of holy water, a gambling die, and a love letter, proof that faith and human frailty always traveled together. As one weary traveler carved into a hostel's wall near Canterbury, I came seeking miracles, instead I found myself. The pilgrim's path was a gauntlet of mortal threats where every mile could be your last. Forests, dense and shadowed, hid more than just roots and brambles. They sheltered bands of outlaws who saw travelers as easy prey. A pilgrim's cloak, meant to mark them as holy wanderers, sometimes made them targets, signaling they carried what little wealth they had sewn into their hems. Even the most well-trodden routes, like the road to Canterbury, were dotted with tales of merchants found with their throats slit, their pockets turned inside out. Pilgrims learned quickly, safety lay in numbers, groups formed at crossroads, strangers clasping hands like old friends, knowing that a lone traveler might vanish without a whisper. But nature itself could be just as merciless. A sudden storm in the Alps could bury a party in snow before they even heard the wind howl. Rivers swelled without warning, sweeping away those who dared to ford them at the wrong moment. And then there were the hostel's sanctuaries in theory, but often cramped, filthy wastestations where disease spread faster than prayers. Typhoid, dysentery, and the ever-present specter of the plague lurked in damp straw beds and shared drinking cups. Pilgrims would wake to find the person beside them stiff and cold. Their journey ended not by divine calling, but by a fever no relic could cure. Hunger was the most patient predator. In fertile regions, villagers might spare a crust of bread or a bowl of thin soup for those they believed carried God's favor. But in barren stretches like the Meseta of Spain, where the sun scorched the earth into cracks, food became a distant memory. Some resorted to chewing on leather straps or boiling weeds. Others, delirious with starvation, hallucinated feasts laid out by phantom monks. The lucky ones stumbled upon a monastery's charity. The rest joined the ranks of the unnamed dead, their bones left to bleach under the same sky they'd prayed would guide them. Yet, against all logic, pilgrims kept walking. Why? Because danger wasn't just an obstacle, it was proof. Every bandit dodged, every storm survived, became a story of divine intervention. A woman bitten by a viper might swear the Virgin Mary appeared to suck the venom from her wound. A man lost in a blizzard would later tell of a mysterious light that led him to shelter, vanishing as soon as he crossed the threshold. These weren't just tales to pass the time, they were the currency of faith traded at every fireside. The road's brutality didn't deter pilgrims, it sanctified them. To suffer was to earn grace, and so they pressed on, their feet bloody but their hearts alight, chasing a promise written in the stars. Stories of divine intervention on the pilgrim trails weren't just whispered in taverns. They were etched into the very stones of cathedrals and scribbled in the margins of monks' chronicles. Take the account of a Flemish weaver named Johanna, who collapsed in the Pyrenees with a festering wound, certain she'd die on the mountainside. She swore a hooded stranger pressed a poultice to her leg without speaking, and by dawn the flesh had knit together as if touched by fire. Or the Saxon knight who, lost in a blizzard near Canterbury, followed the sound of bells no one else could hear, straight to the doorstep of a monastery. Skeptics might call these hallucinations born of exhaustion, but to pilgrims, they were proof heaven's door creaked open for those who dared to walk far enough. What's fascinating is how these miracles mirrored the fears of the road. Guides appeared when travelers were most vulnerable, often at night, in storms or moments of starvation. A Venetian merchant's diary describes a gray-haired woman who materialized to lead his party around a bandit ambush, then vanished near a shrine to the Virgin. Coincidence, perhaps, but pilgrims noted these helpers never asked for payment or praise. They came as beggars, shepherds, even animals. A lone dog leading a lost group to a cave before trotting away. The message was clear: divinity wore humble disguises. Then there were the healings, pilgrims with withered limbs bathing in sacred springs only to find their fingers uncurling by morning. A blind boy from Normandy whose sight returned after sleeping beside St. James's tomb, though he claimed his first glimpse wasn't of the cathedral, but of a man in a dusty cloak smiling at him from the crowd. These stories spread like wildfire because they answered a desperate need. When medicine failed and pain was constant, miracles offered a narrative where suffering wasn't meaningless. A healed wound wasn't just tissue mending, it was a divine finger pressing pause on the world's cruelty. But not all interventions were gentle. Some pilgrims spoke of nightmares so vivid they altered their course, only to learn later they'd avoided a collapsed bridge or plague-stricken town. Others told of eerie compulsions, like an Oxford scholar who turned back 3 times from a mountain pass, driven by a voice like his mother's, sparing him from an avalanche that buried 20 travelers. These weren't just tales to entertain. They were survival strategies, teaching pilgrims to trust instincts that felt like whispers from beyond. The line between faith and psychology blurs here. Did a vision of St. Christopher really carry a sick child across a river, or did fever conjure an image that gave the parents strength to keep going? In the end, it didn't matter. What sustained pilgrims wasn't clinical truth, but the unshakable sense they weren't alone. That's why even the most hardened travelers collected these stories like charms. Because on a road where death lurked in every shadow, sometimes the most miraculous thing wasn't an angel's appearance, but the courage to take one more step when every bone screamed to stop. And so the legends grew, passed from weary mouth to eager ear at wayside fires. Each retelling added layers, a mysterious guide's cloak becoming radiant, a healed wound glowing with holy light. But at their core, these tales shared a truth deeper than facts. That hope, when walked toward long enough, could wear the face of a miracle. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval chapel, a pilgrim's trembling fingers brushed against a glass case holding a sliver of bone said to be from the arm of Saint Anthony. To modern eyes, it might seem like a simple fragment, but to that weary traveler, it was a conduit to the divine. Saints weren't just historical figures to medieval Christians. They were active, breathing presences in daily life, intermediaries who could sway God's ear on behalf of the desperate. Their relics, whether a tooth, a lock of hair, or a thread from their burial shroud, weren't mere keepsakes. They were batteries of holiness, charged with the power to heal, protect, and even rewrite fate. The hunger for these sacred objects bordered on obsession. When the body of Saint Nicholas was moved to the Italian city of Bari in the 11th century, sailors reportedly smuggled fragments of his bones in their teeth, convinced the saint's protection would calm storms. Churches boasted about their relics like merchants hawking priceless wares. The Abbey of St. Denis claimed to possess the crown of thorns, while Trier Cathedral displayed the seamless robe of Christ. Pilgrims would line up for hours, sometimes days, just to glimpse these treasures, believing that even a shadow cast by a relic could cure blindness or banish plague. But relics had a funny habit of multiplying. How could 12 different cathedrals each possess a vial of the Virgin Mary's breast milk, or 20 churches claim to hold the finger bone of John the Baptist? The medieval mind had an answer: divine elasticity. Miracles didn't follow the rules of physics. A saint's power could infuse even the tiniest speck of dust from their tomb. This logic fueled a thriving, if dubious, trade. Unscrupulous merchants sold holy nails from the crucifixion by the dozen, while monks quietly snipped threads from ancient shrouds to meet demand. The church, caught between skepticism and profit, often turned a blind eye. As long as the miracles kept drawing crowds, the most audacious devotees didn't wait for permission. Relic theft was so rampant it spawned its own Latin term, fur to sacra, holy theft. In 871, a monk named Giusdona smuggled the remains of Saints Marcellinus and Peter out of Rome, convinced the saints themselves had whispered approval in his dreams. Centuries later, Venetian merchants broke into an Alexandrian church to steal Saint Mark's body, hiding it under layers of pork to repel Muslim inspectors. These weren't crimes to the thieves, they were rescue missions, liberating saints from neglect and ensuring their power could shine anew. Yet the real magic of relics lay in their ability to collapse distance between heaven and earth, past and present. A pilgrim touching the skull of Saint Catherine wasn't just connecting with a long-dead martyr. They were standing shoulder to shoulder with her in God's courtroom, pleading their case. That's why a scrap of linen or a rusted nail could hold kingdoms ransom. In a world where the invisible was more real than the tangible, relics were the ultimate proof. Heaven wasn't just above. It was right here, humming in the bones of the faithful. The dusty roads leading to holy sites weren't just paths of devotion. They were veins pumping silver and gold into the heart of medieval Europe. Imagine a tavern keeper in Burgundy counting coins as pilgrims devoured his stew, or a metalworker in Tours hammering out thousands of pewter badges stamped with St. Martin's face. Every pilgrim's step meant profit for someone. Towns along the Camino de Santiago didn't just tolerate these travelers, they competed fiercely for their business. Bridges were built, wells deepened, and markets expanded, all to lure footsore faithful into spending their last pennies. A single major shrine could transform a sleepy village into a bustling hub, like Vézelay in France, where the abbeys claimed to house Mary Magdalene's bones turned mud streets into a maze of hostels, stables, and candle shops. Churches played the game masterfully. Charging fees to view relics wasn't just accepted, it was expected. In Canterbury, visitors paid to kiss the spot where Thomas Becket's blood had stained the floor, while Aachen Cathedral displayed its sacred swaddling clothes only once every 7 years, creating a frenzy of demand. Clever clergy knew scarcity drove devotion and donations. Some even staged theatrical openings of relic caskets, timing the reveal to coincide with hushed gasps from the crowd. But the real genius was in the souvenirs. tiny lead amply filled with holy oil from saintly tombs, scraps of cloth rubbed on sacred stones, even jars of dirt from Jerusalem, all sold as tangible proof of a pilgrim's journey. These weren't trinkets, they were spiritual receipts needed to show skeptical neighbors back home that the ordeal had been real. Yet where there's profit, there's always someone willing to cheat. Forgery became pilgrimage shadow industry. Unscrupulous monks discovered new relics whenever funds ran low. A 12th century abbot in Conques found the skull of Saint Faith only after his roof needed repairs. Street vendors peddled dubious artifacts. Splinters claimed to be from Noah's Ark, phials of St. Peter's sweat, even feathers from angels' wings. The trade grew so brazen that Pope Innocent III issued warnings against those who sell the divine, but enforcement was patchy at best. After all, who could prove a saint's knucklebone wasn't genuine when miracles kept happening around it? For all its spiritual trappings, pilgrimage functioned like a medieval Disneyland, complete with long lines, overpriced food, and staged spectacles. But the comparison isn't flippant. Just as modern tourists flock to Paris for selfies with the Mona Lisa, medieval pilgrims endured hardship for a glimpse of a saint's shinbone, believing that sight alone could alter their destiny. The difference: today's souvenirs say, "I heart Rome." Back then, they whispered, "I touched heaven." Beneath the glitter of commerce, though, darker currents swirled. Not every pilgrim arrived with pure intentions, and not every town welcomed them with open arms. For every honest merchant selling bread, there was a cutpurse eyeing bulging coin pouches. And when the relics stopped working, when prayers went unanswered, and miracles dried up, the backlash could be brutal. Faith, after all, was the currency that made the whole system run. Once that trust cracked, even the holiest road could crumble to dust. For every pilgrim who set out with pure intentions, there were others waiting to exploit their desperation. The roads to holy sites became hunting grounds for opportunists, where faith was just another commodity to be bought and sold. Take the sly merchant outside Chartres Cathedral, hawking genuine fragments of the Virgin Mary's veil, though the same scrap of yellowed linen seemed to reappear in his stall every market day. Or the smooth-talking guide near Rome who promised to lead travelers through a secret catacomb full of martyrs' bones, only to abandon them in a dank cellar after pocketing their coins. These weren't just petty thieves, they were masters of psychology, preying on the human need to believe in something tangible. The church itself wasn't immune to corruption. At some shrines, priests demanded payment before allowing pilgrims to touch relics, turning spiritual encounters into transactions. A particularly brazen abbot in Germany was caught selling absolution certificates that supposedly guaranteed shorter time in purgatory, no pilgrimage required. Even the sale of indulgences, officially sanctioned by the church, often crossed into exploitation. Peasants might trade their last cow for a scrap of parchment they couldn't even read, trusting that its Latin scribbles held the power to save their souls. Innkeepers along popular routes developed ruthless tactics. A common scam involved serving pilgrims drugged wine, then robbing them unconscious. Others charged outrageous sums for flea-infested beds, knowing exhausted travelers had no choice but to pay. In coastal towns near Jerusalem, boat captains routinely stranded pilgrims who couldn't afford return passage, leaving them to beg or starve. The irony was bitter. People who'd embarked on journeys to purify their souls found themselves navigating a moral quagmire where everyone seemed to have a hand outstretched not in blessing, but in demand. Yet the most audacious schemes involved relics. A black market thrived in fake holy objects, from splinters of the true cross enough existed to build a small house to vials of St. Catherine's tears that were likely well water. One enterprising forger in Burgundy bred white mice, claiming they were descendants of the lion that spared Saint Jerome in the desert. The trade grew so brazen that in 1284, the Bishop of Paris ordered an investigation only to discover that half the relics in his own diocese were likely bogus. What's fascinating is how pilgrims rationalized these betrayals. Many saw being cheated as part of their penance, a test of humility sent by God. Others clung to the idea that even fake relics might carry grace if approached with true faith. And so the cycle continued. The hopeful still came, the cunning still profited, and the road to salvation remained paved with equal parts devotion and deception. In the end, perhaps the greatest miracle was that anyone emerged from this spiritual marketplace with their faith intact. The road to salvation didn't discriminate by gender, but medieval society certainly did. While men dominated pilgrim roles, women's footprints, though fainter, were no less profound. Picture a widow like Alay of Rouen, her husband's death shroud still clinging to her sleeves as she walked to Santiago, each step a rebellion against the expectation that grief should keep her chained to the hearth. Or young Beatrice of York, who slipped away at dawn to follow rumors of a weeping Madonna in Lincolnshire, leaving a note pinned to her bed with a single word, "Called." These women weren't anomalies, they were quiet revolutionaries, turning pilgrimages into passports for autonomy in a world that granted them none. Marjorie Kemp's story burns brightest in this hidden constellation. A mother of 14 from Norfolk, she didn't just go on pilgrimage, she weaponized it. After visions of Christ left her sobbing uncontrollably in church aisles, her neighbors called her hysterical. Her husband, embarrassed, tried to chain her to domestic life. So Marjorie did the unthinkable. She negotiated her freedom. In a scene straight from medieval feminist theater, she bargained with her spouse, paying his debts in exchange for release from marital duties. Then she set off alone, wearing white, a color reserved for virgins, and preaching in taverns. Priests called her a heretic, crowds mocked her tears. Yet her autobiography, the first in English by a woman, survives as raw testimony. Devotion could be armor when society left you exposed. The risks for women were exponentially higher. A man might lose his purse to bandits. A woman could lose her life, or worse, her reputation. Tales circulated of female pilgrims assaulted in roadside ditches, their stories dismissed as the price of foolishness. Some carried knives hidden in their sleeves or traveled disguised as men, like the legendary Saint Wilgefortes, who grew a beard to escape an arranged marriage. Even well-born women weren't safe. Elena of Aquitaine took hundreds of knights to the Holy Land, yet chroniclers still whispered about her unseemly closeness to her uncle in Antioch. For every Elena, there were countless unnamed women who vanished into the margins, their journeys reduced to parish register footnotes. Johanna, wife of Thomas, departed for Walsingham and did not return. But here's what the archives miss: the cunning beneath the corsets. Women turned societal weakness into spiritual strength. A pregnant pilgrim could beg alms more successfully, playing on sympathy. Older women, freed from childbearing, became unofficial midwives and healers on the road, trading rosemary poultices for protection. And in hostels, they formed networks, whispering warnings about unsafe routes or predatory innkeepers. Their greatest rebellion, claiming the right to sacred exhaustion. While men's pilgrimages were celebrated as heroic, women's were often framed as hysterical, until they returned with relics or visions that even bishops couldn't ignore. The miracle isn't that these women survived the journey. It's that they carved a sliver of sovereignty from a world determined to deny it. When Marjorie Kemp stood before the Archbishop of York, accused of heresy for her tears, she didn't plead. She quoted scripture back at him until he released her. That's the real pilgrimage, not the miles walked, but the space claimed. In the creases of their cloaks, between the lines of their prayers, medieval women carried a truth as potent as any relic. Heaven's gate didn't have a gender lock. Among the sea of pilgrims who returned home with scallop shells and sunburns, a rare few never looked back, choosing instead to vanish into the horizon forever. These were the voluntary exiles, men and women who traded roofs for rootlessness, their entire lives reduced to what they could carry on their backs. Take the case of Bernard the Barefoot, a Burgundian cobbler who in 1243 kissed his sleeping children goodbye and walked out the door with nothing but a sack of moldy bread. For 37 years he crisscrossed Europe, wearing chains around his waist as self-imposed penance, surviving on raw turnips tossed his way by pitying farmers. To villagers, he was either a living saint or a cautionary tale, sometimes both in the same afternoon. What drove someone to choose this life? For some, like the infamous Weeping Woman of Tours, it was public shame after an affair with a priest left her pregnant. She spent decades circling shrines, her feet bleeding through 7 layers of patched leather. Others sought escape from unbearable guilt. A knight named Raymond of Provence became a perpetual pilgrim after accidentally killing his brother in a joust, his armor swapped for a hair shirt crawling with lice. But the most unsettling cases were those who simply dissolved into the road. No dramatic sins, no visible scars, just an unshakable sense that home was a cage and salvation lay in never stopping. Medieval society didn't know what to make of them. Church authorities waffled between admiration and suspicion. One bishop's diary describes encountering a woman who'd walked barefoot from Norway to Jerusalem, twice calling her a mirror of holy endurance. That same year, a council in Lyon declared such rootless wanderers dangerous to good order, accusing them of faking visions to avoid work. The truth was, perpetual pilgrims terrified ordinary people because they represented faith taken to its logical extreme. If giving up everything brought you closer to God, what did that say about those who clung to their warm beds and full purses? Yet these exiles weren't truly alone. They moved within an invisible network of fellow outcasts, leaving coded marks on hostile walls. A circle with a cross meant safe to sleep here, while 3 slashes warned of thieves. Some formed roving families like the Brothers of the Empty Bowl, who shared scavenged broth with toothless grins. Others communicated through songs, their lyrics threaded with directions to sympathetic monasteries or warnings about harsh sheriffs. Their survival depended on this underground telegraph, proof that even those who renounced the world still needed human connection. The most fascinating cases were those who weaponized their exile. In 1321, a woman known only as Margaret the Loud stood in the marketplace of Strasbourg, shouting prophecies about the plague until authorities gagged her. She wasn't punished because who chains a woman who claims to speak for angels? Other exiles became living relics, their matted hair and sun-blackened skin treated as holy objects. A chronicle from Cluny tells of townspeople clipping threads from a wandering hermit's robe, convinced the fabric cured fevers. In the end, perpetual pilgrims were the ultimate paradox, both free and trapped, revered and reviled, closer to heaven yet knee-deep in mud. Their legacy lingers in the quiet corners of history, a reminder that the human soul sometimes finds its voice not in cathedrals, but in the endless rhythm of footsteps on an open road. The pilgrim's cloak could be a garment of grace or a convict's uniform. For every devoted soul who kissed a crucifix before setting out, there was another who shuffled onto the road in chains, prodded by the sharp end of a bailiff's spear. Judicial pilgrimage was medieval Europe's paradoxical punishment, a sentence that mirrored the sacred journeys of the faithful, yet reeked of slow, sanctioned death. Murderers wore blood-red crosses sewn onto their tunics. thieves carried lead tokens stamped with their crimes to present at shrines. These weren't pilgrims seeking salvation, they were human cautionary tales, their very bodies serving as roadside warnings. Take the case of Henrik the blacksmith, recorded in a Strasbourg court ledger in 1324. After killing a man in a drunken brawl, he was given a choice: lose his right hand or walk to Santiago de Compostela and back barefoot, with an iron collar riveted around his neck. He chose the road, but the collar ensured he'd never blend in with other pilgrims. Every village knew him for what he was. Doors slammed shut as he passed. Children threw rotten fruit. By the time Henrik limped home 2 years later, his feet were so mangled he could barely stand, but the court declared his debt paid. Justice in this system wasn't about prisons, it was about visible, theatrical suffering that communities could witness and approve. Heretics faced the cruelest variations. Instead of a single journey, they might be condemned to perpetual pilgrimage, walking circuit between shrines for years, surviving on alms they weren't allowed to beg for directly. In Toulouse, a Cathar woman named Alazaris was sentenced to visit 7 major holy sites while wearing a cloak painted with flames, a reminder of the hellfire she'd narrowly escaped. The real torture wasn't the distance, it was the humiliation. Every gaze stripped her bare, every whisper a reminder that her soul was still on trial. But here's the twist: some judicial pilgrims found unexpected redemption. A Milanese thief named Tommaso, forced to pilgrimage after stealing church silver, returned with a reputation as a miracle worker. Villagers claimed he'd healed a blind child by sharing his moldy bread near Vézelay. Whether by genuine conversion or cunning survival, he'd turned his punishment into power. Others weren't so lucky. Records from Canterbury describe skeletal figures collapsing at the city gates, their sentencing parchments still clutched in stiff fingers. For them, pilgrimage wasn't rehabilitation, just a longer, more public execution. The system's darkest irony, it mirrored the very pilgrimages it perverted. Both demanded suffering as currency for grace. Both transformed bodies into maps of penance. The only difference was who held the knife, God or the law. As one weary bailiff scrawled in a margin, watching a shackled man disappear down the road, "We send them to find mercy, most only find the grave." The gleaming spires of distant cathedrals might have drawn pilgrims toward salvation, but the roads between them often ran with blood. For every tale of miraculous protection, there were a dozen stories of knives flashing in firelight, of desperate souls turning on one another like starving dogs. The pilgrim's cloak, meant to mark its wearer as sacred, became just another target, especially when rumors spread of coins sewn into its lining. Bandits weren't the only threat. Pilgrims themselves sometimes morphed into predators. A Swiss chronicle from 1422 recounts 2 French travelers who smothered their roommate in a Leon hostel, stealing his boots and the lead badge he'd bought as proof of reaching Santiago. When caught, they claimed the man had cursed at the Virgin, a lie as flimsy as the straw mattress they'd hidden his body under. Shelter sparked its own brutalities. In crowded hostels, space was currency. A Florentine merchant's diary describes pilgrims sleeping in shifts, clutching their staffs like weapons, while outside, latecomers pounded on locked doors until their knuckles split. Fights erupted over scraps of floor near fireplaces, over stolen blankets, even over the right to lean against a wall. The church tried to impose order. Monks at Cluny Abbey instituted a lottery system for beds, but hunger and exhaustion made beasts of the devout. At Rocamadour, a relic site in France, a woman was trampled to death in 1481 when crowds stampeded toward a display of the Virgin's veil. The official record called it an accident. Survivors whispered about elbows sharpened like daggers. Then there were those who weaponized piety. con artists perfected the weeping penitent act, sobbing about lost purses to swindle compassionate travelers only to vanish before dawn. Fake relic sellers worked in teams, one creating a distraction while another palmed a pilgrim's purse, but the most insidious predators wore clerical robes. A notorious priest near Canterbury was defrocked in 1394 for running a brothel disguised as a hospice, where charitable women offered comfort to lonely travelers for a donation that lined his pockets. The Church's attempts to police such abuses were laughably inadequate. Bishops issued decrees against unseemly conduct on pilgrim routes, but with no real enforcement, corruption thrived like mold on damp hostel walls. Yet even in this moral quagmire, flickers of humanity survived. A letter from a German knight tells of a thief who returned a stolen relic after dreaming of the saint's disapproving frown. In Burgos, Spain, a prostitute named Marisol turned her brothel into an infirmary during a plague outbreak, using skills learned from watching pilgrims treat blisters. The road's darkness never fully extinguished such sparks, perhaps because pilgrimage at its core was always about flawed people groping toward light. For every knife drawn in greed, another hand reached out in mercy. The miracle wasn't that the roads were safe, it was that anyone emerged from them with faith intact. Pilgrim hospitals stood as paradoxical beacons along the medieval road, simultaneous symbols of divine mercy and mortal peril. Picture a weary traveler staggering through the gates of the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, his feverish body collapsing into the arms of a white-robed Hospitaller knight. The air smelled of vinegar and herbs, the floors strewn with rushes that hadn't been changed in weeks. Here, monks moved like shadows between pallets, offering sips of honeyed wine to the dying and pressing poultices of crushed garlic to festering wounds. These institutions were medieval Europe's first true hospitals, funded by donations from penitent nobles and run by orders like the Antonines, who specialized in treating St. Anthony's fire, a gruesome condition caused by poisoned rye. The charity was genuine. At Canterbury's Eastbridge Hospital, founded in the 12th century, pilgrims received 3 days of free care, broth, bread, and a straw mattress shared with strangers. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded that guests be treated as Christ himself, and many monks took this literally. A chronicle from Cluny describes a brother who washed the gangrenous feet of a shoemaker, then kissed them, murmuring, "These sores are but jewels in heaven's crown." But goodwill couldn't conquer biology. With no understanding of germ theory, caregivers unwittingly spread death with every reused bandage and unwashed hand. A well-meaning nun might wipe pus from one patient's eyes with a cloth, then dab another's forehead with the same fabric, seeding epidemics in the name of compassion. Crowding turned these sanctuaries into death traps. At the height of pilgrimage season, hospitals like Santo Spirito in Rome crammed 50 patients into a single vaulted hall, their breath mingling in the damp air. Straw mattresses became petri dishes of lice and fleas, while open latrines seeped into water sources. The very rituals meant to comfort communal meals, shared communion cups, became vectors of doom. Records from Santiago's Royal Hospital reveal that during a plague outbreak in 1383, over half the pilgrims admitted died within a week, their bodies carried out in pre-dawn processions to avoid panicking new arrivals. Yet for all their horrors, these places saved far more lives than they claimed. A pilgrim with a broken ankle might survive thanks to a monk's traction device, a rope and pulley system that seemed brutal but often healed fractures perfectly. Herbal remedies, though primitive, sometimes worked. Willow bark tea eased fevers, while moldy bread pressed to wounds, unknowingly harnessing early penicillin prevented infections. And then there were the miracles no medicine could explain. The ledger of Roncesvalles Hospital in the Pyrenees notes a young boy revived after being declared dead, his lips moving in prayer exactly as the monks began his requiem. Whether divine intervention or misdiagnosis, such stories kept hope alive. The true legacy of pilgrim hospitals lies in their contradictions. They were places where the selfless and the squalid coexisted, where a brother's prayer could be as potent as his poultice was poisonous. To modern eyes, they might seem like houses of horror, but to a shivering traveler glimpsing their lanterns through the rain, they were the closest thing to angels' hands on earth. And sometimes, against all odds, those hands held tight. A pilgrim returning from Canterbury didn't just bring back blisters and stories, they wore their proof on their sleeve. Literally, clusters of lead badges, each no bigger than a coin, jingled from their hat brim or cloak, stamped with images of St. Thomas Becket's martyred body or the shrine that housed his relics. To modern eyes, these might look like cheap trinkets, but in the Middle Ages they were power objects. A badge wasn't just a memento, it was a battery of holy protection, believed to radiate blessings long after the journey ended. Some even contained crumbs of sacred dust or threads from a saint's shroud sealed inside, turning the wearer into a walking reliquary. The market for these badges exploded into a medieval version of mass tourism. At major shrines, stalls sold designs specific to each site: a scallop shell for Santiago, crossed keys for Rome, Veronica's veil for Jerusalem. Wealthy pilgrims might commission silver versions, while the poor settled for thin tin ones that would bend in a stiff wind. But demand bred deception. Unscrupulous merchants near pilgrimage routes hawked counterfeit badges to travelers too exhausted to notice the difference. A 12th century chronicle from Vézelay complains of vendors selling Compostela shells that had never touched St. James's tomb, their edges suspiciously smooth compared to the genuine article's rough ridges. What's fascinating is how these tokens blurred the line between sacred and souvenir. Some pilgrims treated them like spiritual armor, nailing badges to their front doors to ward off plague or sewing them into children's clothing as talismans. Others collected them like medieval passport stamps, showing off rows of badges to prove their spiritual mileage. A few even repurposed them as teaching tools. A badge showing Jonah swallowed by the whale became a bedtime story prompt, while one depicting the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian sparked conversations about suffering and grace. But the real magic lay in their ability to collapse distance. For a peasant who'd never leave their village again, touching a neighbor's Jerusalem badge let them virtually trace the Via Dolorosa with their fingertips. When a mother pinned a Canterbury badge to her sick child's blanket, she wasn't just invoking St. Thomas, she was reaching across miles to press her hand against the cold stone where his blood had fallen. That's why forgery wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal. A fake badge didn't just cheat the purse, it broke the chain linking the faithful to the divine. Yet even the humblest badge held power when belief backed it. A story from 14th century Ghent tells of a beggar whose only possession was a cracked Santiago badge, worn smooth from years of rubbing. When a nobleman mocked it, the beggar retorted, "The saint's grace isn't measured in lead but in the weight of the journey." The nobleman, shamed, later paid for the man's funeral and kept the badge for himself. Such tales reveal the deeper truth. These little discs of metal weren't just objects. They were mirrors reflecting the medieval soul, part devotion, part pride, and always hungry for a touch of the holy. Before smartphones or even printed maps, pilgrims clutched something far more precious: handwritten guidebooks filled with secrets only the road-weary knew. Imagine unrolling a parchment copy of the Codex Calixtinus, its ink slightly smudged from generations of anxious fingers tracing the same lines. This 12th century masterpiece wasn't just directions, it was a survival manual for the soul. Within its pages, pilgrims found everything from the best places to ford a river near Pamplona, to which innkeepers in Burgos watered down their wine. One section even warned of a bridge near Portomarin where bandits posed as beggars' advice that could mean the difference between reaching Santiago or vanishing into a ravine. But these guides did more than steer feet, they shaped hearts. Each milestone came with tailored prayers, transforming physical travel into spiritual theater. Crossing the Pyrenees, there was a psalm for that, spotting the first glimpse of the cathedral spire. A hymn of thanksgiving waited. The codex didn't just describe the route, it choreographed an entire emotional journey, teaching pilgrims how to feel at each turn. Some passages read like medieval TripAdvisor reviews, praising the monks at Roncesvalles for their hearty bean soup while cautioning against the eel pies sold near Leon that oft provoke grievous lamentations. What's startling is how modern these guides feel. The codex included star charts for navigation, lists of relic authenticity ratings 3 out of 5 stars for St. Eulalia's tooth, but 5 for her kneecap, and even phrasebooks for bargaining in foreign markets. One section taught pilgrims to say, "I hunger" in Basque, a language so alien to most travelers that the scribe resorted to phonetic Latin. Gosia dut became Gos I ardut. Yet beneath the practicality lurked darker truths. Some entries hinted at routes altered by war or plague, with hastily added notes like, "Avoid the valley beyond Toulouse, for there be wolves and worse." Others contained coded warnings. A sketch of a hooded man with no caption might signal a village where pilgrims mysteriously disappeared. These weren't just books, they were living documents, updated by each generation's tragedies. A margin note in one copy reads simply, "Brother Paulus took this road in 1302. His bones rest near the crooked oak." The real genius of these guides was their balance of hope and horror. They acknowledged the road's terrors while insisting grace waited just beyond them. A stained page might describe a thief-infested forest, then detail the exact prayer to St. Christopher that saw the scribe safely through. That duality, clear-eyed about danger yet stubbornly optimistic, captures the medieval pilgrim's paradox. They knew the world was vicious, but believed heaven hovered just overhead, close enough for a determined traveler to touch. Today, fragments of these guides survive in library vaults, their edges brittle but their urgency undimmed. Unfolding one is like hearing whispers across 8 centuries, voices urgent with hard-won wisdom, determined that no one walk the path unprepared. They remind us that every journey, no matter how sacred, begins with a very human question: what should I pack and where do I sleep? Even faith, it seems, needs a roadmap. Among the whispered tales pilgrims shared around flickering campfires, none struck deeper fear than the legend of the Wandering Jew. The story spread like a shadow across medieval Europe, of a shoemaker named Ahasuerus who scorned Jesus as he carried the cross to Calvary, only to hear the chilling words, "You shall wander until I return." Condemned to walk the earth without rest or death, his body aging but never failing, he became the ultimate cautionary figure. Pilgrims crossing the Alps swore they glimpsed a gaunt figure with a long white beard watching from the mist, his eyes hollow with centuries of regret. This wasn't just a ghost story. The Wandering Jew embodied every pilgrim's deepest dread that their sacred journey might become an endless curse. Medieval society viewed rootlessness with suspicion. Those without a fixed place were either saints or sinners, with little room in between. The legend warned that mockery of holy things carried consequences beyond the grave. A 15th century preacher in Cologne described meeting the wanderer outside the city gates, his sandals worn to nothing, muttering, "I denied him rest, so rest denies me." Whether truth or invention, such accounts sent shivers down spines, especially among those who'd taken to the road lightly. But the tale also revealed uncomfortable truths about pilgrimage itself. Like the Jew, pilgrims were liminal figures, neither fully of the world they'd left nor yet part of the divine realm they sought. Their dusty cloaks and blistered feet marked them as outsiders, vulnerable to both bandits and divine judgment. Some hostels even painted his image above their doors as a reminder. Sacred travel demanded sincere devotion, not tourist curiosity. A marginal note in a pilgrim's journal from 1392 captures this tension. Saw a wanderer near Vézelay who knew Latin and Hebrew. Gave him bread, then crossed myself after. Was it him? The genius of the legend lay in its contradictions. The wandering Jew was both damned and pitied, a villain and a victim. His eternal journey mirrored the pilgrim's temporary one, raising unsettling questions. What if penance never ended? What if God's mercy had limits? These fears found their way into art. Woodcuts showed the wanderer slumped against cathedral walls, his face a map of wrinkles, while children's rhymes warned against scoffing at beggars. Lest you become him, the verse concluded, yet for all its horror, the story held a strange comfort. However long the road, pilgrims knew their wandering had an end point. Unlike the cursed shoemaker, they could kneel before a shrine, unburden their sins, and turn for home. The legend's true power wasn't in frightening travelers, it was in making them grateful their journey, however hard, was finite. As one anonymous pilgrim carved into a hostel wall near Canterbury, better blisters than his boots, that simple line captures the medieval mind at work. Even in darkness, they found a way to measure their light. The dusty roads walked by medieval pilgrims didn't just lead to shrines, they wound their way into the very heart of art and literature, leaving trails of ink and pigment that still shimmer with life centuries later. Picture a tapestry hanging in a nobleman's hall, its threads weaving not just scenes of travelers but an entire philosophy. The stumbling pilgrim, staff in hand, became everyman, his journey a mirror for the human condition. This was no accident. Artists understood that pilgrimage's physical hardships, the blisters, the hunger, the gnawing doubt, echoed the inner struggles of every soul trying to navigate a fallen world. In stained glass windows from Chartres to Canterbury, pilgrims appear haloed not by light but by their own determination, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and ecstasy that anyone who'd ever chased a dream could recognize. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales exploded this idea into riotous, unforgettable color. On the surface, it's a rollicking collection of stories told by travelers killing time on the road. But peel back the layers, and you'll find a razor-sharp commentary on the gap between spiritual ideals and human frailty. The wife of Bath brags about manipulating 5 husbands while wearing a scarlet cloak meant to signal piety. The pardoner peddles fake relics with the slick charm of a carnival huckster. Even the knight, the noblest of the group, can't resist spinning a tale more suited to a tavern than a sermon. Chaucer's genius was showing pilgrimage as it really was a messy, bawdy, profoundly human affair where salvation sat cheek by jowl with sin, and holiness wore mud-spattered boots. Yet these artistic depictions weren't just reflections, they became blueprints. After Canterbury Tales spread across Europe, pilgrims began consciously acting out its tropes, forming storytelling circles, adopting Chaucerian archetypes, even mimicking the miller's drunken laugh or the prioress's affected French. Art didn't just record the pilgrimage experience, it reinvented it, giving travelers a script for how to perform their own journeys. Songs carried the same power. The Cantigas de Santa Maria, a collection of Galician hymns from the 13th century, turned miracles on the road into catchy, danceable tunes. Pilgrims sang them while walking, the rhythms syncing with their footsteps. transforming grueling marches into something like communal theater. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the quietest artworks, the graffiti. On the walls of hostels and cathedrals, ordinary pilgrims carved their names alongside simple sketches: a scallop shell, a weeping Madonna, a pair of blistered feet. These weren't acts of vandalism but declarations of "I was here." Unlike grand tapestries commissioned by kings, these scratchings held the raw immediacy of lived experience. A single initial and a date, J. De Leon 1412, could conjure an entire life. The blisters that never healed, the thief who stole his shoes, the moment he finally glimpsed the spires of Santiago through the rain. In the end, medieval art did something remarkable. It took an act of personal devotion and made it collective, transforming solitary footsteps into a chorus that still resonates today. When we laugh at Chaucer's sly humor or trace a finger over centuries-old graffiti, we're not just observing history, we're walking beside those pilgrims, sharing their aches and their epiphanies, reminded that every journey, no matter how sacred, is ultimately human. The world of pilgrimage that had thrived for centuries began to crumble under the weight of Reformation-era axes, both literal and ideological. In 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that Wittenberg church door, he wasn't just protesting indulgences, he was taking aim at the entire economy of sacred travel. Why should men crawl to Rome when God dwells as near in their own kitchens? He thundered. This wasn't just theological debate, it was a revolution in how people conceived of holiness itself. Pilgrimage, once the ultimate act of penance, became synonymous with Catholic superstition overnight. Reformers mocked relics as dead men's bones, tore down roadside shrines, and published pamphlets depicting gullible peasants kissing fake saintly toenails. The movement spread like wildfire through northern Europe, leaving smoldering wreckage where vibrant pilgrimage routes once thrived. Violence accelerated the decline. The 30 Years' War turned Germany's sacred roads into battlegrounds, where pilgrims were as likely to encounter marauding soldiers as helpful monks. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries saw Canterbury's gold-plated shrine to Thomas Becket smashed into pieces, its jewels pocketed by royal agents. A chronicler from Glastonbury described watching workmen toss the abbey's famed relic, including a thorn supposedly from Christ's crown, onto a bonfire while townsfolk wept. For every shrine destroyed, 1,000 ordinary people lost their connection to centuries-old traditions. The pilgrim's cloak, once a badge of honor, now marked its wearer as a target for Protestant zealots or opportunistic thieves. Yet even in this upheaval, glimmers of the old ways persisted. Some Catholic regions doubled down on pilgrimage as an act of defiance. In Spain, the Camino de Santiago saw renewed devotion as Philip II promoted it as a bulwark against Protestant heresy. Bavarian farmers secretly preserved fragments of relics in hollowed-out loaves of bread, passing them hand to hand like contraband. And in a poignant twist, many Protestant reformers found themselves creating new pilgrimages by accident. Wittenberg became a destination for Luther's followers, who chipped pieces off his tomb as souvenirs. The human need to touch the divine couldn't be legislated away. It simply found new outlets. The real transformation, though, was interior. As physical pilgrimages declined, Protestant thinkers recast the metaphor inward. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress replaced dusty roads with spiritual allegories, where every Christian's heart became the landscape to be traversed. The shrine was no longer a place but a state of grace. This shift didn't kill pilgrimage, it decentralized it. No longer dependent on corruptible relics or distant cathedrals, the sacred journey became portable, personal. A weaver could experience epiphany at her loom. A cobbler might find redemption in mending a child's shoe. The road hadn't vanished, it had folded inward, waiting to be rediscovered in quieter ways. What emerged from this chaos wasn't an end, but a reinvention. The same fervor that once sent millions tramping toward Rome now fueled Bible reading, hymn singing, and personal prayer. The shells and badges didn't disappear, they morphed into Protestant tokens like inscribed rings or embroidered scripture verses. And when wars subsided and shrines reopened centuries later, the pilgrims who returned carried both rosaries and Reformation psalms in their pockets. The road had changed, but the longing that built it remained, proof that even the deepest traditions can adapt without dying. After all, a journey isn't defined by its path, but by the heart that walks it. The scallop shells still clatter against backpacks along the Camino de Santiago, but today's pilgrims check Google Maps between sips of espresso. This paradox, ancient paths trodden by smartphone light, captures the strange magic of modern pilgrimage. While armored knights no longer patrol the Pyrenees and bandits don't lurk in the shadows, just the occasional overpriced souvenir vendor, the essence of the journey persists. Walk the Camino in July, and you'll see Korean grandmothers hiking beside German college students, all united by blisters and the quiet thrill of spotting a yellow arrow, the medieval trail marker still guiding the way. The dangers have shifted from wolf attacks to Wi-Fi withdrawal, yet the hunger for transformation remains unchanged. What's fascinating is how deliberately some modern travelers resurrect medieval rhythms. In Roncesvalles, the same stone-walled hostel that sheltered 12th-century pilgrims still offers bunk beds, now with charging ports beside the candle niches. Pilgrim credentials, once inked by monks, get stamped at cafes and albergues, evolving into a quirky mix of spiritual passport and scavenger hunt. Some even carry replicas of medieval badges, not as talismans but as conversation starters with history. A Dutch architect walking the Camino last year told me he'd sewn a leather pouch for his phone to mimic those used for carrying relics, joking, "My Spotify playlist is my holy object now." Yet beneath the Instagram snaps and protein bars, something deeper simmers. The same questions that haunted medieval travelers, why am I here, what do I carry that's too heavy to keep, surface during long stretches where the only sound is gravel crunching underfoot. Modern pilgrims might not fear highwaymen, but they confront inner thieves, self-doubt, unresolved grief, the nagging sense that life's become transactional. The road still strips people bare, just in new ways. A Tokyo salaryman walking the Camino in 2019 described weeping at a village fountain, realizing he'd spent a decade collecting promotions like pilgrim badges, but with no shrine at the end. The resurgence of these ancient routes reveals a quiet rebellion against modern life's speed. Medieval pilgrims walked to earn grace. Today's often walk to escape the tyranny of efficiency. In Burgos, I met a nurse from Minnesota who'd quit her job after burning out in the pandemic. "Out here, no one cares if I'm productive," she said, rolling out her sleeping bag in a 14th century pilgrim hospital turned hostel. The only deadline is sunset. That's the real continuity, not the gear or the gadgets, but the stubborn human need to measure life in footsteps rather than screen time. Even the miracles have adapted. Where medieval chronicles told of spring's healing blindness, modern blogs brim with stories of strangers paying for meals or knee pain vanishing after a night's rest. A Belgian cyclist last year swore a farmer's wife near Lyon predicted the exact hour her lost wedding ring would be found, and it was. Coincidence, maybe. But as any medieval pilgrim could have told you, hope wears whatever costume the era allows. The ultimate testimony to pilgrimage's enduring power lies in the numbers. The Camino's annual visitors swelled from a few hundred in the 1970s to over 400,000 today. From Japan's 88-temple Shikoku Trail to Utah's newly designated Peace Pilgrimage, old routes are rediscovered and new ones forged. It turns out the Middle Ages understood something we're just relearning. That salvation, however you define it, rarely comes from standing still. The road still calls not because it's easy, but because it's human to need a horizon. There's a moment around the third day of walking when something shifts in the pilgrim's mind. The blisters have formed, the initial excitement has worn off, and the rhythm of footsteps begins to hollow out a space between who you were and who you might become. Psychologists call this the liminal zone, a threshold where the rules of ordinary life loosen their grip. For medieval pilgrims, this was sacred ground. Stripped of social rank, freed from the grind of harvests or loom work, they entered a state where miracles felt possible precisely because the familiar had fallen away. A nobleman might weep beside a farmer, sharing bread as equals, while the road ahead blurred into a metaphor for life itself, uncertain, arduous, and pulsing with hidden meaning. Modern science confirms what these travelers intuited. The monotony of long-distance walking triggers a mental state akin to meditation, lowering the brain's default mode network activity, the part responsible for self-referential thoughts and anxieties. In simpler terms, the road empties you out. Stories from contemporary pilgrims echo medieval accounts. A corporate lawyer on the Camino realizing she'd spent years arguing for victories that left me empty, or a grieving widower who found himself laughing for the first time in years after days of silent walking. The psychology is timeless. When stripped of distractions, the mind turns inward, sifting through unresolved pains or unspoken yearnings. What's fascinating is how medieval culture institutionalized this process. Pilgrimage wasn't just encouraged, it was designed to maximize liminality. The pilgrim's uniform, a coarse cloak, a scallop shell, acted as a social equalizer. Rituals like confessing sins before departure or receiving a blessing at crossroads reinforced the sense of crossing into sacred time. Even the landscapes were curated. Routes wound past caves associated with visions, springs linked to healing, and peaks where the sky seemed close enough to touch. Every detail whispered the same message: you are no longer who you were, yet the real magic lies in pilgrimage duality. It's both intensely personal and profoundly communal. A 12th century chronicle describes two strangers meeting on the road to Vézelay, one a knight fleeing guilt, the other a mother praying for her sick child. By journey's end, they'd become makeshift family, the knight carving a toy horse from oak to distract the child from fever. Today's pilgrims report nearly identical bonds, students sharing sunscreen with retirees, language barriers dissolving over shared blisters. The liminal space doesn't just transform individuals, it rewires how they connect. Perhaps that's why pilgrimage thrives in our secular age. The relics may be metaphorical now, a locket left at a trailside shrine, a journal entry scribbled under a hostel's flickering bulb, but the hunger remains. We still long for rituals that force us to shed our daily skins, for landscapes that mirror inner upheavals. When a Silicon Valley engineer walks the Camino to reset his brain, he's chasing the same alchemy that drew medieval peasants to touch a saint's bones, the hope that movement might somehow rearrange the soul. The road never promises answers, but it always offers the one thing we secretly crave: a chance to become, even briefly, unknown to ourselves, and that's a miracle no era outgrows. Consider the broken-hearted widow who walked from Paris to Rocamadour in the dead of winter, her bare feet leaving bloody smudges in the snow, or the guilt-ridden knight who crawled the final miles to Canterbury, his knees shredded on flinty roads as he replayed the battle where he'd failed to save his lord. These weren't just acts of penance, they were profound psychological rituals, physical manifestations of inner torment that medieval culture lacked the vocabulary to name. Today, we'd call it trauma therapy. Modern research reveals what medieval pilgrims intuitively understood. Rhythmic movement, walking, kneeling, even the sway of a pilgrim ship can reorganize chaotic thoughts. Neurologists note how bilateral stimulation, left-right, left motion soothes the amygdala, the brain's panic button. Medieval pilgrims walking 8 hours a day were essentially administering their own exposure therapy, their staffs tapping a steady beat that mirrored the heart's need for rhythm after loss. The very roads became treatment plans, structured, goal-oriented, with built-in milestones like shrines where pilgrims could measure progress not in miles, but in emotional release. The medieval world had no therapist's couches, but it did have something equally potent: storytelling circles around hostile fires, pilgrims sharing tales of dead children, betrayed loves, or battlefield horrors weren't just passing time. They were participating in early group therapy. The act of framing pain into narrative, especially among fellow sufferers, mirrors modern cognitive behavioral techniques. A 15th-century priest's diary describes a soldier recounting a massacre so vividly that he vomited, then slept peacefully for the first time in years. Today, we'd recognize this as catharsis, the purging of traumatic memory through speech. But pilgrimage's genius lay in its duality. It wasn't just about purging pain, it offered a roadmap for rebuilding. The rituals, lighting candles, touching relics, even the communal singing of psalms provided what psychologists now call behavioral activation, small achievable tasks that combat despair's paralysis. A pilgrim who'd lost her entire family to plague might find herself responsible for a stranger's bleeding feet, the act of care restarting her capacity for connection. Modern studies on long-distance hikers show similar patterns. The combination of physical exertion, nature immersion, and simplified decision-making where to sleep, when to eat creates ideal conditions for post-traumatic growth. Perhaps most strikingly, pilgrimage acknowledged what medieval medicine couldn't, that some wounds aren't in the body but the soul. The Church's very concept of melancholia, a precursor to our understanding of depression, often prescribed what we'd now recognize as behavioral interventions: sunlight exposure during walks, social bonding in pilgrim groups, even the serotonin boost from repetitive prayer. Of course, not all pilgrimages ended in healing. Some travelers disappeared into their grief, becoming the perpetual wanderers who haunted crossroads. But for many, the road's alchemy, exhaustion, breaking down old neural pathways while new vistas literally expanded their world, offered something no leech or Latin chant could: a way forward, one step at a time. This wasn't medieval ignorance, it was instinctive wisdom. When a mother who'd buried 3 children sewed their names into her cloak and walked to Santiago, she wasn't just seeking divine intervention. She was externalizing her pain, mapping it onto physical space so her mind could begin to process it. The scallop shell she brought home didn't magically cure her sorrow, but the act of earning it might have made the weight just bearable enough to carry. That's the paradox pilgrimage understood centuries before psychology existed. Sometimes to stand still is to drown, and so they walked not away from their pain, but through it, trusting that the road itself would teach them how to breathe again. While European pilgrims trudged toward Canterbury or Santiago, another stream of travelers flowed across deserts toward Mecca, their cloaks not woven wool but seamless white ihram cloth, their prayers not Latin psalms but Arabic verses calling, Labbaik Allahumma labbaik, here I am, O God. The Hajj, Islam's 5th pillar, shared medieval Christianity's belief in journey as purification, yet its rituals unfolded with a precision that would astonish a wandering medieval friar. Every step was choreographed: the circling of the Kaaba, the running between Safa and Marwa, the standing at Arafat under a pitiless sun. Unlike Christian pilgrims who chose their destinations based on personal vows or relics, every able Muslim aimed for the same sacred geography, creating a unity of purpose that transcended language and tribe. Parallels run deeper than blistered feet. Just as Christian pilgrims swap tales of St. James appearing as a shepherd, Hajj chronicles brim with miracles: wells sprouting in barren valleys, sandstorms parting to reveal hidden paths. A 12th century Persian traveler wrote of seeing a blind man's sight restored after drinking Zamzam water, while Andalusian poet Ibn Jubayr described pilgrims surviving bandit attacks thanks to angels in the guise of Bedouin. Both traditions understood danger as divine testing. When European accounts warned of alpine avalanches, Hajj guides cautioned against the Red Death heatstroke, claiming those who ignored dawn departures across Arabia's scorched plains. Yet the contrasts revealed just as much. While Christian pilgrims often traveled alone or in small groups, the Hajj was and remains a tidal wave of humanity. Medieval caravans from Cairo or Damascus could swell to 50,000 people, their sheer numbers offering safety but also breeding contagion. Where European hostels competed for business, Hajj infrastructure was meticulously organized centuries earlier. Wells dug at fixed intervals, paid guards patrolling routes, even a postal system relaying messages between Mecca and distant capitals. The Hajj wasn't just a spiritual act, it was a logistical marvel that knit the Islamic world together. Ritual differences highlight each faith's theological fingerprints. Christian pilgrims sought physical contact with relics, kissing Thomas Becket's blood-stained shirt or pressing sore knees to St. Foy's golden statue. Islamic tradition, wary of idolatry, focused on reenactments, walking where Abraham stood, drinking from Hagar's spring, symbolically stoning the devil. One tradition clung to tangible fragments of holiness, the other prioritized timeless gestures. What binds them is the raw humanity left in the margins. A Genos merchant's diary from 1482 describes sharing figs with a Moroccan family on the road to Mecca, their laughter transcending his pidgin Arabic. Mamluk-era court records tell of a cairn widow who walked the Hajj alone after her sons died, her feet wrapped in rags, surviving on dates tossed from passing litters. These weren't theological abstractions but flesh and blood struggles, proof that whether the destination was Jerusalem or Mecca, the truest miracles often unfolded between people, not shrines. Perhaps the most poignant similarity lies in the homecoming. Just as Canterbury badges sparked envy in European villages, returning Hajj pilgrims earned the title Al-Hajji, their status forever elevated. A 15th century Yemeni poem captures the paradox. You left a sinner, return a saint, yet your heart knows the sandal blister still throbs. East or west, the pilgrim's greatest challenge wasn't the journey out, but the return carrying holiness back into a world content with the mundane. That tension, more than any ritual, is the thread stitching these traditions together across continents and centuries. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 1300s, it didn't just kill bodies, it warped souls. Pilgrims who'd once walked sunlit roads to shrines now stumbled through landscapes where smoke from mass graves hung like a shroud. The plague's fury transformed sacred journeys into acts of raw desperation. In Avignon, a chronicler described barefoot processions of flagellants, their backs striped with self-inflicted wounds, chanting that the apocalypse had come. These weren't traditional pilgrims, they were human storm clouds rolling from town to town in a frenzy of penance, convinced their blood might appease a wrathful god. Some carried bizarre relics, the jawbone of a saint said to ward off pestilence, or vials of holy arsenic that promised protection. the roads, once arteries of devotion, became fever dreams where faith curdled into terror. Yet even as some saw pilgrimage as the cure, others branded it the disease. Town gates slammed shut against travelers, their cloaks now suspected of harboring more than just dust. In Milan, authorities demanded pilgrims bathe in vinegar before entering, while Venice imposed brutal quarantines 40 days trapped on a stinking island, where many succumbed to plague before ever touching the relics they'd come to see. The irony was cruel. Those seeking salvation often brought death instead. A heartbroken account from Lincolnshire tells of a mother who walked 80 miles to Walsingham, praying for her sick children, only to return and find the village barricaded, her family's corpses already burning on a pyre. The church, caught between panic and profit, waffled. Some bishops ordered relics paraded through streets to cleanse the air, while others forbade pilgrimage outright, fearing mobs would loot shrines for magical protection. In Paris, the shrine of Saint Genevieve became a battleground, desperate citizens breaking in to kiss her bones, while guards beat them back with pikes. The chaos revealed pilgrimage's double edge. It could be both a lifeline and a noose. Amid the horror, glimmers of defiance shone. In Salisbury, a group of plague survivors, their faces still pocked with sores, set out for Canterbury, not to beg for mercy, but to give thanks for living. Their journey, recorded in a monk's shaky script, speaks to pilgrimage's uncanny resilience. Even when the world crumbled, the human need to walk toward meaning survived. The roads they traveled, littered with the dead, became proof of a terrible truth that sometimes the only way through hell is to keep moving. The medieval pilgrim's cloak may have frayed to dust centuries ago, but their footprints still press into the modern soul. These travelers left us more than scallop shell souvenirs and crumbling hostile graffiti. They forged a blueprint for the human spirit that transcends time. Consider how their journeys mirror our own restless searches today. That merchant who traded his stall for a staff wasn't so different from the cubicle worker booking a one-way ticket to Bali. The widow walking barefoot to Walsingham shares DNA with the grief-stricken father running marathons to honor a lost child. The terrain has changed, but the heartbeat beneath remains identical. Movement as medicine, distance as deliverance. What makes their legacy endure isn't the relics they touched, but the truths they uncovered along the way. Pilgrim diaries brim with moments of startling modernity, a knight's realization that his armor weighed less when shared, or a weaver's diary entry marveling at how hunger sharpened her prayers like a blade on stone. These weren't medieval quirks, they were hard-won revelations about resilience. Modern psychology confirms what they learned empirically, that suffering with purpose transforms pain, that community dissolves isolation, that forward motion, even when directionless, can rewire despair into hope. The Pilgrim's Road was the original self-help manual, written in blisters and starlight. Yet their greatest gift may be the permission they grant us to wander without apology. In an era obsessed with productivity, their lives whisper a counter-narrative that sometimes the most sacred act is stepping away. The 15-year-old who followed a vision to Compostela against her father's shouts. The bishop who traded his mitre for a beggar's bowl. These choices weren't recklessness, they were revolutions against the tyranny of should. When we scroll past viral posts about quiet quitting or hustle culture burnout, we're hearing echoes of those medieval rebels who knew a terrible secret: you don't have to bleed to prove you're alive. Perhaps that's why pilgrimage routes are thriving again. The Camino's hostels now shelter atheists and agnostics alongside the devout, all united by a shared understanding that walking washes away layers of pretense. A Wall Street banker and a college dropout blistering their feet on the same Pyrenees path would have made perfect sense to a medieval pilgrim. They knew what we're relearning: the road doesn't care about your title or taxes. It only asks if you can bear the weight of your own truth. So the next time you feel the tug of an open highway or the itch to disappear into a forest trail, remember, you're not just taking a walk. You're joining an unbroken chain of seekers stretching back 1,000 years. Your backpack holds their legacy, the stubborn faith that around the next bend, something or someone might make the struggle worthwhile. Whether your sanctuary is a mountain vista or a subway seat at dawn, the pilgrim's spirit lives wherever feet move toward meaning. Their journey never ended. It just passed the